Years ago, I was working in Dallas, and I would take my lunch a couple of times a week and do what work for a charity known as Meals on Wheels. If you're not familiar with it, they deliver a hot meal to someone that's in need, and it's free. Most of those people are either elderly or housebound. They're all housebound, but like I said, they're either elderly or some of them that aren't elderly or have a really serious disease. All of these people that I met enhanced my life in different ways. One of the most memorable was a woman that described herself as big and ugly. She lived in this tiny little house in Dallas, and I really enjoyed sitting and talking to her because she had very interesting stories. At the time, I believe she was about 90 years old, and she was a big lady. One day sitting there, I pointed to this picture that was on her dresser, and it looked like Hopalong Cassidy, who was a TV star in the 50s. And I said to her, "That guy looks like Hopalong Cassidy with that great big black hat he has on." Hopefully about now in this video, you see a picture of a guy that looks like Hopalong Cassidy. She told me that was my husband. I said, "He really looks like he likes that hat." She said he always wore that hat. I even buried him in that hat. He said that hat hid his shame. That took me back. I asked her to tell me the story, and she did. And now, best as I can, I'm going to recount it to you. She said when she was like 17 or 18 years old, this cowboy, the one that ended up being her husband, came to her father's house. Now, this was like in the 19 teens. And she said that all the other girls were married. Back then, you got married at 14 or 15 and you usually had a child, 16 or 17. But she was something like 18 years old and not married. And she said, "I'm big and I'm ugly. And I knew men wouldn't be interested in me. They like pretty girls, or at least petite girls, not someone like me. I was even bigger than my dad." But the cowboy said to my father, "I'd like to marry your daughter." And my dad said, "You must be 30 years or 40 years older than her." He said, "Nonetheless, if she'll have me, I'd like to marry her." So my dad said, "Well, it's up to her." And he asked me, "Do you want to marry this guy?" And I thought, but not for long. And I said to the cowboy, "I will marry you and I will be a good wife to you, but there is a condition." He asked what it is. And I said, "Never hit me." And he said, "I would never hit you. I will be a good husband." So we got married. And we had this little place in downtown Dallas, which was then pretty wild. We kept corrals down there and we sold horses. Every summer, my husband would go out to the west and catch wild horses and bring them back for us to sell. And we made a decent living. We lived in this little house on this muddy street with the corrals right out back. One day, a drummer, by the way, if you don't know what a drummer is, that's a salesman. A drummer came to the house, and he used to sell supplies to my husband. And he said to my husband, "Let's go across the street to the saloon and have a drink before we eat dinner. Hopefully your wife will cook dinner." And I said to my husband, "You know, the work's not done yet." And he backhanded me, knocked me down. It really hurt. The salesman broke out laughing, and they both walked over to the saloon across the street. "Well, this little house," she said, "that we lived in had this cast iron stove. And the stove was right next to the front door because the house was really tiny. And I would cook on that stove in a big frying pan. So I started making dinner, knowing they'd expect that when they came back. and I heard them coming across the street. They'd gotten drunk, and they were yelling, "Dinner better be ready." And I prayed. I prayed that my husband would be the first one through that door. And the door opened, and he stepped up, and I started my swing with that frying pan. And I connected right on his forehead, and it was my husband. And he flew back out of that house and landed in the muddy street. And I walked out there holding that frying pan, and I said to that drummer, "Do you got anything to say?" And the drummer took off. So some of the neighbors came out and said, "I think you've killed him." And one stooped down and checked. And he said, "He's alive, but we better get him in and get him some medical attention." I told him, "Unless you want this frying pan laid upside your head, you leave that dog lie where he is." So he laid there all night. The next morning, I went out and picked him up and carried him in. I nursed him for weeks. It was a good, maybe 2 months. Excuse me. Before he could get up. And he had a huge scar where I laid him open. It had torn the skin off his skull. So he asked me to get him a hat, and I went out and bought that black hat. And he pressed it down hard on his face, and he wore it just like that the rest of his life. We were together for 25 or 30 years. Can't really remember. I'm getting old, she said. But it was something like that. And after that incident, he never hit me again. And he was a good husband. Towards the end, when he was dying, he said he wanted me to bury him in that hat so people wouldn't see his, as he said, shame. I said, "I'll have the undertaker cut the back off and bury you in that hat." He said, "Yes, they shouldn't see my shame." For years, he said, I thought the shame was that my wife bested me in a fight, and I hid that. But now I realize the shame is that I mistreated my wife and hit her, and I never should have done that. And I apologize and ask you to forgive me. I buried him with that hat, and I look back on it, and he was a good husband. And I'm glad I laid him down. She said, "When you're a big, ugly woman, you don't have much choice in who you marry. But still, I married the right guy." I told her, "I don't think you're big and ugly." She said, "Ron, look at me. I'm 90 years old, and I'm almost as big as you. I'm big. And the mirror says I'm ugly." And I said, "That mirror's lying to you." She laughed and she said, "Well, there is a liar in this room. I don't know if it's the mirror or you." Thinking back on her, she was big. She was big in character. She was not ugly, for that mirror showed the physical self. What I saw was the spiritual self, and she was beautiful in spirit. And my life is better for having known her.